Welcome to Stonygates, a grand Victorian estate turned reformatory, where secrets hide behind every curtain. When a gunshot rings out during a theatrical play, Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, steps into a web of deception. A trusted philanthropist's dark secret unravels embezzlement, betrayal, and murder. With a sly boy's sketch and a ledger's clues, Marple exposes the killer in a deadly game of mirrors. In just 9 chapters, truth shatters. Illusions and justice prevails in this classic Agatha Christie mystery. Chapter 1. An unexpected invitation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table. A small fire crackled in the grate, warding off the autumn chill, and the rhythmic click of knitting needles punctuated the quiet. Miss Marple, her white hair neatly pinned, sat in her favourite armchair, a half-finished shawl draped across her lap. Beside her, on a tray adorned with a sprig of lavender, rested a cup of tea, now grown cold, and a letter that had arrived with the morning post. The letter was from Carrie Louise Rogold, a friend from Miss Marple's schooldays at a genteel academy in Florence. The two had not met in years, their lives diverging Carrie Louise to a series of marriages and philanthropy, Miss Marple to the tranquil rhythms of village life, yet the bond of youth, fragile but enduring, held fast through occasional letters. This one, however, was different, written in Carrie Louise's fine, sloping hand. It carried an undercurrent of unease that Miss Marple's keen eye could not ignore. "My dear Jane," it began, "I should so love to see you again. Stonygates is not so far, and I cannot quite say why that your presence would do me good. Things are not altogether as they should be here, though I may be imagining. It do come, if you can." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she reread the lines. "Not altogether as they should be," she murmured, "in St. Mary Mead." Such phrases often cloaked scandals or secrets. Mrs. Price's nerves had masked her son's gambling debts, and old Mr. Hawes's misunderstanding had involved a pilfered church fund. Carrie Louise, ever gentle and optimistic, was not one to cry wolf. If she sensed trouble, there was trouble indeed. The invitation was to Stonygates, Carrie Louise's home, a grand Victorian estate now repurposed as a reformatory for delinquent boys. Miss Marple recalled snippets from earlier letters. Carrie Louise's third husband, Louis Sericold, a man of fervent ideals, had founded the institution to rehabilitate young offenders through education and trust. A noble endeavour, Miss Marple thought, but one fraught with complexities. Boys with troubled pasts, a sprawling household, and Carrie Louise's vague unease her instincts, honed by years of observing human frailties, stirred. She rose, her movements brisk despite her age, and retrieved her writing case. A short note to her nephew Raymond, declining his latest offer to whisk her to London, was dispatched, followed by a reply to Carrie Louise accepting the invitation. By evening, Miss Marple had arranged for her neighbour, Miss Knight, to tend the cottage and had packed a modest suitcase with practical tweeds, a good shawl, and her second-best hat. As she locked the cottage door the next morning, she felt a familiar thrill not of adventure, but of purpose. The train to wound through patchwork fields and sleepy villages, the rhythm of the wheels lulling Miss Marple into reflection. She thought of Carrie Louise as she had been in Florence, a delicate girl with wide, trusting eyes, always seeing the best in others. Too trusting, perhaps, Miss Marple mused, her fingers smoothing the edge of her handbag, The station at Stonygates was a small affair, and a chauffeured car awaited her, sent by Carrie Louise. The driver, a taciturn man with a reformatory badge on his cap, spoke little, but Miss Marple noted his calloused hands and the faint scar above his brow marks. Of a life not always gentle, Stonygates itself was a study in contrasts. The estate loomed at the end of a long drive, its gables and turrets softened by climbing ivy, a relic of aristocratic splendor. Yet beyond the manicured lawns stood utilitarian buildings, dormitories and classrooms, their red brick stark against the old stone. A group of boys in neat uniforms swept leaves near the gate, their faces guarded but curious. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them, recalling the village lads of St. Mary Mead, some of whom had strayed before finding their way. Carrie Louise greeted her at the entrance, her frail frame wrapped in a cashmere shawl. Her hair, once golden, was now silver, but her smile was as warm as Miss Marple remembered. "Jane, you haven't changed a bit," she exclaimed, embracing her friend. Miss Marple, returning the embrace, thought Carrie Louise looked tired, her eyes shadowed despite her cheer. Louis Siracle joined them, a tall man with a scholar's stoop and a handshake both firm and fervent. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, his voice rich with conviction. "Carrie Louise speaks so highly of you. Welcome to our little experiment in redemption." They led her through the house, its high ceilings and oak-panelled walls echoing with history. Portraits of Carrie Louise's ancestors gazed down, their stern faces at odds with the modern bustle boys carrying books, staff hurrying with papers. Louis explained the reformatory's mission with zeal, to reform through trust, not punishment. "These lads need faith in themselves," he said, gesturing to a boy polishing a banister. Miss Marple nodded politely, but her attention was elsewhere on the boy, who avoided Louis's gaze, and on Carrie Louise, whose smile faltered when Louis spoke of funds. Tea was served in a drawing-room overlooking the gardens, where preparations for an amateur theatrical performance were underway. A makeshift stage stood on the lawn, and young voices called out lines from a script. "It's for the reformatory," Carrie Louise explained, "a melodrama to raise funds. The family's all involved. Gina's the star, of course." Her voice held pride, but Miss Marple caught a tremor. She sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing details: the play, the reformatory, Carrie Louise's unease, and Louis's fervent idealism. In St. Mary Mead, such fervour often hid something else: ambition, guilt, or worse, as they toured the grounds. Miss Marple sensed a discord beneath the surface. A staff member's curt reply to Louis, a boy's furtive glance, Carrie Louise's hesitant pause when asked about visitors. These were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. They returned to the house as dusk fell, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Miss Marple, settling into her guest room, unpacked her knitting and gazed out at the shadowed estate. "Not altogether as they should be," she repeated softly. Whatever troubled Stonygates, she would find it, as she always did, in the quiet corners where truth hid. Chapter 2. The players assembled the morning after her arrival at Stonygates. Miss Jane Marple awoke to the distant clang of a bell, a remnant of the estate's days as a grand family seat, now repurposed to signal the reformatory schedule. Sunlight streamed through the heavy damask curtains of her guest room, illuminating the faded wallpaper and the sturdy mahogany furniture. She rose with her customary briskness, her joints protesting only faintly, and dressed in a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her appearance as unassuming as ever. Yet her pale blue eyes, sharp and inquisitive, missed nothing as she prepared for the day. Carrie Louise's letter, with its veiled hint of trouble, lay folded in her handbag, a silent reminder of her purpose. Breakfast was served in the dining room, a cavernous space with a long oak table and a chandelier that gleamed despite its age. Miss Marple descended the grand staircase, her hand light on the polished banister, and noted the bustle of the household. Reformatory boys, identifiable by their neat grey uniforms, moved quietly through the hall, carrying trays or sweeping the floor. Their discipline impressed her, but she caught a flicker of defiance in one lad's glancer, reminder of the village boys in St. Mary Mead, who hid mischief beneath polite facades. Carrie Louise was already at the table, her delicate hands cradling a cup of tea. She smiled warmly as Miss Marple entered, but her eyes held a trace of weariness. "Jane, I do hope you slept well," she said, her voice soft but earnest. "This old house can be draughty." "Quite comfortably, thank you," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat. "The air here is wonderfully fresh." Her tone was polite, but her gaze swept the room, cataloguing the occupants. Louis Sericold sat at the head of the table, his lean face animated as he discussed the reformatory's progress with a young man in a tweed jacket, introduced as Edgar Lawson, his personal assistant. Edgar nodded eagerly, his nervous energy palpable, his eyes darting to Louis with a mix of admiration and anxiety. The family began to assemble, each arrival adding to the tapestry of relationships Miss Marple was already weaving in her mind. First came Mildred Street, Carrie Louise's daughter from her first marriage. A woman in her late 40s with a pinched expression and a drab brown dress that seemed chosen to underscore her disapproval. She greeted Miss Marple with a curt nod, her eyes lingering on her mother with a possessive air. "Mother, you mustn't over-tear yourself with this play nonsense," she said, her voice sharp. Carrie Louise only smiled, accustomed to Mildred's fussing. Next entered Gina Hudd, Carrie Louise's granddaughter, a vision of youth and vitality. Her dark hair was swept into a careless bun, and her scarlet sweater contrasted boldly with the room's muted tones. She flung herself into a chair with a laugh, her energy infectious. "Good morning, Granny darling." "Oh, and you must be Miss Marple. Grandma's told me all about you." Her American accent, softened by her years in England, carried a warmth that made Miss Marple smile. Yet she noted Gina's quick glance toward the door, as if expecting someone. That someone was Walter Hudd, Gina's husband, who slouched in moments later. A tall, broad-shouldered American with a brooding air. He wore a leather jacket that clashed with the room's formality. His greeting was a mumbled morning, and he sat beside Gina, his eyes fixed on his plate. Miss Marple, buttering her toast, observed the tension between them. Gina's bright chatter seemed too great on Walter, who responded in monosyllables. In St. Mary Mead, such silences often hid domestic discord, and Miss Marple filed the observation away. The final arrivals were Stephen and Alex Resticott, Carrie Louise's stepsons from her second marriage to Johnny Resticott, a theatrical impresario, long deceased. Stephen, the elder, was in his early 30s, with a lean frame and a quick, charming smile. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of care, and his conversation sparkled with wit as he described the play's rehearsals. Alex, slightly younger, had a more flamboyant air, his cravat and tousled hair suggesting an artistic temperament. He was the play's author, and his enthusiasm for its melodrama filled the room. "It's a proper spectacle, Miss Marple," he said, leaning toward her. "You'll see Gina's a natural star." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was busy. Stephen and Alex's rivalry was subtle, but evident in their competing anecdotes, each vying for the table's attention. She recalled village lads who postured similarly, their boasts masking deeper insecurities. Their devotion to Carrie Louise seemed genuine, but she wondered how. They viewed Lewis's reformatory, which consumed so much of the estate's resources. The meal was interrupted by the arrival of Christian Gulbranson, a trustee of the reformatory and Carrie Louise's stepson from her first marriage to a Norwegian philanthropist. A man in his late 50s, Christian was tall and broad, with a stern face softened only by his greying beard. His unexpected appearance caused a ripple of surprise. Lewis rose to greet him, his smile tight. "Christian, we weren't expecting you until next month," he said, his tone cordial but strained. "Business brought me early," Christian replied, his accent clipped. He shook Miss Marple's hand with formal courtesy, his grip firm but brief. As he took his seat, Miss Marple noted his guarded demeanour, his eyes scanning the table as if assessing each person. Carrie Louise's smile faltered, and Mildred's lips pursed. Even Gina's chatter paused, her gaze flickering between Christian and Lewis. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt the atmosphere shift, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Breakfast concluded, and the household dispersed to prepare for the day's rehearsals. Carrie Louise invited Miss Marple to join her for a walk through the gardens, a suggestion Miss Marple accepted with alacrity. The gardens were a blend of formal beds and wilder patches, reflecting Stonygates' dual nature. As they strolled, Carrie Louise spoke of the reformatory, her voice glowing with pride. "Lewis believes in these boys, Jane. He sees potential where others see only failure." Her words were heartfelt, but Miss Marple caught a hesitation, as if she were convincing herself as much as her friend. They paused by a rose arbor, where a reformatory boy was pruning bushes under the supervision of a staff member. The boy, wiry and sharp, had glanced up, his expression wary. Miss Marple smiled at him, but he looked away, his movements quick and precise. "They're good lads, mostly," Carrie Louise said, following her gaze. "But some take time to trust us." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of the village shopkeeper's son, who had stolen apples until kindness, not punishment, turned him around. As they returned to the house, the sounds of rehearsal drifted from the great hall. Gina's voice, clear and dramatic, rose above the clatter of props. Carrie Louise led Miss Marple inside, where the household was transforming the hall into a makeshift theatre. A heavy velvet curtain hung at one end, and wooden benches were arranged for the audience. Stephen directed a group of boys, moving scenery, his commands crisp but encouraging. Alex, scribbling notes on a script, called out suggestions, his energy frenetic. Walter lounged in a corner, his arms crossed, watching Gina with a frown. Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting, observed them all, her needles clicking steadily. Edgar Lawson hovered near Lewis, who was reviewing papers at a side table. Edgar's deference to Lewis was almost theatrical, his every gesture seeking approval. Miss Marple, who had seen such devotion in village acolytes, often masking ambition or insecurity, found his behavior intriguing. She also noted Christian Gulbranson, who stood apart, his arms crossed, watching the preparations with a frown. His presence seemed to unsettle Lewis, who glanced at him frequently, his pen pausing over the page. Carrie Louise joined Miss Marple, her hands clasped nervously. "It's all rather chaotic, isn't it?" she said, her laugh light but strained. "The play means so much to Lewis. It's a chance to show what the reformatory can do." Miss Marple murmured agreement, but her eyes were on Christian, who had approached Lewis and was speaking in a low, urgent tone. She could not hear their words, but Lewis's posture stiffened, and Edgar's face clouded with unease. In St. Mary Mead, such hushed exchanges often preceded revelations of debts, affairs, or worse. The rehearsal began, and Miss Marple watched with interest. The play, a melodrama of mistaken identities and thwarted love, was florid but engaging. Gina shone as the heroine, her gestures graceful and her lines delivered with passion. Stephen's direction was meticulous, coaxing nuance from the amateur cast, while Alex's script, though overwritten, had a certain charm. The reformatory boys, tasked with props and lighting, moved with surprising precision, though Miss Marple noticed one lad slight, with a sly grin lingering near the wings, his eyes darting toward Lewis's table. She made a mental note of him, recalling a village boy who had pilfered sweets while feigning diligence. As the rehearsal progressed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the dynamics she had observed. Mildred's resentment of Gina was palpable, her comments laced with envy of her niece's beauty and ease. Walter's brooding silence suggested discontent, perhaps with Stonygates or his marriage. Stephen and Alex's rivalry, though cloaked in banter, hinted at deeper tensions, possibly over Carrie Louise's affection or the estate's future. Christian's unexpected arrival and his guarded exchanges with Lewis suggested a purpose beyond a routine visit, and Lewis himself, with his fervent idealism, seemed almost too perfect. Like the vicar in St. Mary Mead who had preached charity while hiding a gambling habit. Lunch was a simpler affair, served in the dining room with the family and Christian. The conversation turned to the reformatories' funding, a topic Lewis addressed with passion. "Every penny goes to the boys," he said, his eyes bright. "We're building futures, not just buildings." Christian's expression remained impassive, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of skepticism in his gaze. Mildred, picking at her salad, muttered about the estate's upkeep, her tone implying neglect. Gina, trying to lighten the mood, teased Stephen about his stage directions. But Walter's scowl deepened, and he left the table abruptly. After lunch, Miss Marple retired to the drawing room, where she took up her knitting and reflected. The household was a microcosm of human nature, each person a thread in a complex pattern. Carrie Louise's unease, Christian's scrutiny, Lewis's zeal pointed to a disturbance beneath the surface. She thought of her village, where secrets simmered behind closed doors, revealed only through patience and observation. Stonygates, she sensed, held such a secret, and she resolved to unravel it. As the afternoon waned, the rehearsal resumed, and Miss Marple returned to the hall. The players were in high spirits, the boys laughing as they adjusted lights, Gina twirling in her costume. Yet the undercurrents remained Christian's watchful silence, Lewis's forced cheer, Walter's absence. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving connections. In St. Mary Mead, trouble often hid in plain sight, masked by smiles or good intentions. Here, among the players of Stonygates, she suspected the same. Chapter 3. The stage is set. The third morning at Stonygates dawned with a mist that clung to the estate's rolling lawns, softening the outlines of the reformatory buildings and lending the old house an air of mystery. Miss Jane Marple, rising early as was her habit, stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The scene reminded her of St. Mary Mead on foggy days, when secrets seemed to hover just out of sight, waiting for a keen eye to pierce the haze. She dressed with care, choosing a neat tweed suit and her sensible walking shoes, anticipating a day of observation. Carrie Louise's cryptic unease, coupled with the tensions she had observed at breakfast the previous day, had sharpened her. Resolved to understand the undercurrents at Stonygates. Downstairs, the household was already stirring. The great hall, where the theatrical performance was to take place, buzzed with activity as the family and reformatory boys prepared for a final rehearsal. Miss Marple descended the staircase, her steps light but deliberate, and paused in the hall to survey the scene. The heavy velvet curtains, drawn back to reveal a makeshift stage, framed a set painted to resemble a Gothic manor fitting. She thought, for the melodrama Alex Restorick had penned. Boys in grey uniforms moved props. Under Stephen Restorick's direction, their movements efficient but tinged with the restless energy of youth. Gina Hudd, radiant in a rehearsal costume of flowing blue silk, practiced her lines with a reformatory lad who stammered his responses. His awe of her evident dot. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair near the back, her knitting bag at her side. Her needles began their familiar click, a soothing rhythm that belied the intensity of her observation. She noted Stephen's precise instructions to the boys, his charm tempering his authority, and Alex's animated gestures as he adjusted the script, his cravat slightly askew. Louis Sericold stood to one side, conferring with Edgar Lawson, whose nervous deference seemed more pronounced today. Carrie Louise, seated nearby, watched the preparations with a fond smile. But Miss Marple caught a flicker of anxiety in her eyes when Louis glanced her way. The rehearsal began, and Miss Marple found the play, titled The Heart's Deception, to be a florid but engaging tale of love and betrayal. Gina's performance was captivating, her voice carrying the heroine's passion with natural grace. The reformatory boys, tasked with minor roles and stagecraft, acquitted themselves well, though Miss Marple's attention was drawn to one lad's light, with sharp features and a sly grin, whom she recognized from the previous day's rehearsal. He handled the lighting, his movements deft but his eyes constantly roving. Lingering on Louis and Edgar, she made a mental note to learn his name, recalling a St. Mary Mead boy who had filched apples with similar cunning. As the rehearsal progressed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Christian Gulbranson, whose unexpected arrival had cast a shadow over the household. He had not appeared at breakfast, and his absence now was conspicuous. She recalled his stern demeanour and the guarded exchange with Louis at the dining table, a moment that had reminded her of village council meetings where polite words masked deeper conflicts. Her musings were interrupted by a commotion at the hall's entrance. Christian entered, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face set in a frown. He carried a leather briefcase, its edges worn, and his eyes scanned the room before settling on Louis. Louis excused himself from Edgar and approached. Christian, his smile cordial but strained. "Good to see you, Christian. Will you join us for the rehearsal?" His tone was welcoming, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw. Christian shook his head, his voice low but firm. "I've matters to discuss, Louis, privately." He glanced at Carrie Louise, who rose and joined them, her expression one of quiet concern. The trio moved toward the study, a panelled room off the hall, and Miss Marple, adjusting her knitting, strained to catch their words. She heard only fragments, accounts and discrepancy before the study door closed. The rehearsal continued, but Miss Marple's focus remained on the study. In St. Mary Mead, closed doors often hid revelations. Mrs. Clement's private chat with the choir director had uncovered an embezzled collection plate. She wondered what Christian's matters entailed and why they required such urgency. Her attention was drawn back to the stage when Gina faltered in her lines, her eyes flicking toward Walter Hudd, who had just entered. Walter, his leather jacket creased, leaned against a wall, his brooding gaze fixed on his wife. Gina recovered quickly, but Miss Marple noted the brief tremor in her voice, a sign of strain that echoed the village newlyweds who quarreled behind closed doors. Mildred Street appeared next, her drab dress a stark contrast to the hall's vibrancy. She took a seat near Miss Marple, her lips pursed as she watched Gina. "Such a fuss over this play," she muttered, her voice low but audible. "Mother shouldn't be troubled with it." Miss Marple murmured a sympathetic reply, her needles never pausing. Mildred's resentment of Gina was evident, but her concern for Carrie Louise seemed genuine, if overbearing. Miss Marple filed this away, thinking of a St. Mary Mead spinster who had cloaked jealousy in solicitude. The rehearsal broke for lunch, and Miss Marple joined the family in the dining room. The meal was simple but hearty: roast chicken, potatoes, and a compote of autumn fruit served by reformatory boys under the watchful eye of a matronly staff member. Christian did not join them, and Lewis explained his absence with a casual remark about trustee business. Carrie Louise, seated beside Miss Marple, spoke of the play's fundraising goals, her enthusiasm tinged with fatigue. "It's for the boys' education," she said, her hands fluttering. "Lewis says it's vital." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes were on Lewis, whose fork paused mid-air at the mention of funds. The conversation turned to the reformatory, and Lewis spoke with his usual fervor. "We're not just reforming boys, we're reshaping society," he declared, his eyes bright. Edgar nodded vigorously, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting look of doubt in his expression, quickly masked. Stephen and Alex, seated opposite, exchanged a glance, their smiles polite but strained. Gina, trying to lighten the mood, teased Alex about the play's overwrought dialogue. But Walter's scowl deepened, and he excused himself abruptly. Miss Marple, slicing her chicken, thought of the village blacksmith, whose temper had flared when his wife laughed too freely with others. After lunch, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, ostensibly to admire a portrait of Carrie Louise's grandfather, but in truth to observe the household's movements. She saw the sly-faced boy whose name, she learned from a passing staff member, was Ernie, carrying a crate of props. He paused near the study door, his ear cocked as if listening, before hurrying away. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. In St. Mary Mead, eavesdropping often led to discoveries. Like the maid who overheard the grocer's tax evasions, she approached Carrie Louise, who was arranging flowers in a vase, and gently probed about Christian's visit. "He seems a serious man," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. Carrie Louise sighed, her fingers pausing over a rose. "Christian's always been devoted to the reformatory. He handles the trust's finances, you know, but he's been preoccupied lately." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple did not press, sensing her friend's reluctance. Instead, she offered a comforting smile, her mind racing. Finances, she thought, were often the root of trouble, as they had been when the St. Mary Mead treasurer borrowed from the parish fund. The afternoon rehearsal was livelier, with the cast gaining confidence. Miss Marple took her usual seat, her knitting a pretext for her watchfulness. She noticed Ernie again, now adjusting a spotlight, his grin wider as he bantered with another boy. His ease with the equipment was notable, but his frequent glances toward the study door were more so. She resolved to speak with him later. recalling how a kind word had once coaxed a confession from a village lad who stole eggs. As the rehearsal neared its climax, a dramatic scene involving a staged gunshot, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Christian. She had seen him emerge from the study earlier, his briefcase clutched tightly, his face grim. He had approached her briefly, his manner formal but strained. "Miss Marple, you have a reputation for insight," he said quietly. "I may need to consult you on a matter of trust." Before she could respond, he was called away by Lewis, and the moment passed. His words, however, lingered, echoing the village solicitor who had hinted at fraud before disappearing to London. The rehearsal ended, and the household dispersed to prepare for dinner. Miss Marple, lingering in the hall, approached Ernie as he packed away props. "You're very skilled with the lights," she said, her voice warm. Ernie's grin faltered, but he shrugged. "COC, Miss Jess, gotta know the switches." She nodded, offering a peppermint from her bag, a tactic that had softened many a St. Mary Mead youth. "You must see a lot, working backstage," she added casually. Ernie's eyes narrowed, but he took the sweet, mumbling something about folks talking too much. Before she could probe further, Stephen called him away, and Miss Marple let the moment pass, her suspicions deepening. Dinner was a formal affair, with the family dressed in evening attire. Christian joined them, his presence commanding but subdued. The conversation was stilted, with Lewis steering it toward the reformatory successes. Mildred complained about the estate's maintenance costs, her tone sharp, while Gina's attempts at levity fell flat. Walter, silent through most of the meal, left early, citing a headache. Miss Marple, savouring her soup, observed the measured responses, Lewis's forced cheer, Carrie Louise's quiet unease. It was like a St. Mary Mead dinner party, where polite words hid simmering grudges. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the drawing-room, where a fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. She took up her knitting, her mind sifting through the day's observations. Christian's matter of trust, Ernie's eavesdropping. The tensions among the family all pointed to a disturbance beneath Stonygates' surface. She thought of the play, with its themes of deception and hidden truths, and wondered if it mirrored the household's reality. In St. Mary Mead, truth often emerged in quiet moments, revealed by a careless word or a fleeting glance. Here, she sensed, the stage was set for such a revelation, and she would be ready when it came. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple passed the study on her way to bed. The door was ajar, and she glimpsed Christian inside, poring over papers, his brow furrowed. Lewis stood nearby, his voice low but urgent. She caught only a phrase "must be resolved" before moving on, her presence unnoticed. In her room, she sat by the window, her knitting idle. The mist had lifted, revealing a starry sky, but the haze of secrets at Stonygates remained. She thought of Carrie Louise's letter, its plea for her presence, and felt a quiet certainty. Whatever troubled this house, she would uncover it, as she always did, with patience and a clear eye. Chapter 4. A shot in the dark. The evening of the theatrical performance at Stonygates arrived with a crisp autumn chill, the air heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and anticipation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her guest room, adjusted her best black lace shawl over a sober but elegant dress, her appearance as unassuming as ever. Yet her pale blue eyes, sharp and watchful, betrayed the keen mind that had already begun to unravel the threads of unease woven through the household. The great hall, transformed into a theatre, awaited its audience. and Miss Marple sensed that the night's performance would reveal more than the melodrama on stage. Carrie Louise's vague fears, Christian Gulbrinson's cryptic words, and the sly glances of the reformatory boy Ernie had set her instincts alight. Much as a village gossip's whisper had once led her to a pilfered church fund in St. Mary Mead, she descended the grand staircase, her steps measured, and joined the stream of guests flowing toward the hall. The locals' villagers, reformatory staff, and a few county notables mingled with the household, their chatter a lively hum. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting a warm glow over the velvet curtains and polished wood of the stage. Miss Marple chose a seat near the back, her knitting bag tucked beside her, though she had no intention of knitting tonight. From this vantage point, she could observe both the performance and the audience. Her village-honed habit of watching faces serving her well. The hall filled quickly. Carrie Louise, fragile but radiant in a silver gown, sat near the front with Louis Sericold, whose earnest smile seemed strained. Gina Hudd, resplendent in her costume, flitted among the guests. Her laughter bright, but her eyes darting to Walter Hudd, who lounged near the stage, his expression sullen. Mildred Street, in a severe grey dress, sat stiffly, her disapproval of the frivolity evident. Stephen and Alex Restorick, both in evening attire, moved with easy charm. Stephen ensuring the boys' props were in place, Alex adjusting the lighting with theatrical flair. Christian Gulbrinson, sombre in a dark suit, took a seat alone, his leather briefcase at his feet, his stern face unreadable. Miss Marple noted Edgar Lawson, Lewis's assistant, hovering near his employer, his nervous energy almost palpable. As the lights dimmed, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The play, The Heart's Deception, began with a flourish, Gina's entrance as the heroine drawing gasps from the audience. The reformatory boys, handling props and lights, moved with surprising precision, though Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Ernie, whose sly grin flashed as he adjusted a spotlight. The melodrama unfolded a tale of mistaken identities and thwarted love, its dialogue florid but engaging. Yet Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, sifting through the day's observations, Christian's request for a private meeting with Louis and Carrie Louise, his mention of a matter of trust, and Ernie's furtive behaviour near the study. In St. Mary Mead, such signs often preceded trouble, like the baker's lad who had overheard a blackmail plot while delivering rolls. The play reached its climax, a tense scene where the villain, played by a reformatory boy, threatened the heroine with a pistol. The staged gunshot was to be the signal for a dramatic rescue, and the audience leaned forward, caught in the suspense. Miss Marple, however, felt a prickle of unease, her instincts honed by years of sensing discord, as the actor raised the prop. Gun, a sharp crack rang out louder, more visceral than any theatrical effect. The audience gasped, some laughing, assuming it part of the drama. But Miss Marple's heart sank. She knew the sound of real danger, as she had known it when a poacher's rifle echoed through St. Mary Mead's woods, signalling a tragic accident. The play continued, the actors unaware, but Miss Marple's eyes scanned the hall. Louis had slipped out earlier, she recalled, citing a need to check papers in the study. Christian, too, had been absent since the interval, his seat empty. The curtain fell to enthusiastic applause, and the lights rose, revealing a flurry of movement. Carrie Louise, pale but composed, rose to thank the audience, but her voice faltered as a reformatory boy rushed to her side, whispering urgently. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the crowd, caught the boy's words. "It's Mr. Goldbranson, ma'am." In the study, a murmur rippled through the hall as Lewis reappeared, his face ashen. He conferred with Carrie Louise, then addressed the guests, his voice steady but strained. "A small incident, nothing to alarm you. Please enjoy the refreshments." The audience, sensing something amiss, began to disperse, but Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded, her mind racing. She thought of the village hall, where a small incident had once masked a theft, and knew this was no trifling matter. She rose and approached the study, where a knot of household members had gathered. Inspector Curry, a local policeman, summoned by a quick-thinking staff member, was already there, his manner calm but authoritative. The study door was ajar, and Miss Marple glimpsed Christian Goldbranson slumped in a chair, a dark stain spreading across his chest. A revolver lay on the desk, its barrel glinting in the lamplight. Carrie Louise, supported by Gina, stifled a sob, while Lewis stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mildred, her face pale, muttered about disgrace, and Walter, hovering at the edge, looked shaken but silent. Stephen and Alex, arriving late, exchanged a glance, their usual rivalry forgotten. Inspector Curry, a stocky man with a shrewd gaze, began questioning the household. Lewis explained that Christian had been working late in the study, reviewing trust papers. "I left him there before the play's climax," Lewis said, his voice hollow. "I heard nothing unusual, the play was so loud." The revolver, he admitted, was his, kept in a drawer for protection, though rarely used. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, noted the tremor in his hand, a detail that reminded her of a St. Mary Mead farmer who had lied about a stolen cow. The inspector established that the shot had coincided with the play's staged gunshot, masking its sound. No one had a clear alibi, as the household had been scattered on stage, backstage, or among the audience. Gina, tearful, said she had been performing, unaware of anything amiss. Walter, who had been in the wings, claimed he saw nothing, his tone curt. Stephen and Alex, both backstage, vouched for each other, though their quick agreement struck Miss Marple as rehearsed. Mildred, seated in the audience, insisted she had noticed Lewis's absence, but thought little of it. Edgar Lawson, trembling, said he had been fetching props, his devotion to Lewis evident in his anxious glances. Miss Marple, invited by Inspector Curry to share her observations, spoke softly. "The timing of the shot was no accident, Inspector. It was planned to blend with the play's noise, a clever disguise." Her words, delivered with gentle certainty, drew nods from Curry, who valued her reputation for insight. Privately, she thought of a village fete where a firecracker had hidden the theft, and suspected a similar sleight of hand here. As the police secured the scene, Miss Marple spoke with Carrie Louise, who had retreated to the drawing room. Her friend's hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief. Christian was worried about the reformatory's funds, Carrie Louise confessed, her voice barely audible. "He said there were irregularities. I didn't want to believe it." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind turning to Lewis, whose fervour for the reformatory had seemed almost too perfect. In St. Mary Mead, such zeal often cloaked ulterior motives, like the choirmaster who preached virtue while pocketing donations. She sought out Ernie, finding him near the stage, packing away props. His sly grin was gone, replaced by a wary expression. "Terrible thing, miss," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Miss Marple offered another peppermint, her voice kind but probing. "You hear a lot, don't you, Ernie?" Backstage, near the study, he hesitated, then shrugged. Folks talk. Mr. Gulbranson was asking questions about money, like made Mr. Sir Eccled proper cross. His words, though vague, confirmed her suspicions, and she let him go, recalling a St. Mary Mead lad who had spilled secrets for a sweet. The household retired in shock, the guests long departed. Miss Marple, alone in her room, sat by the window. The starry sky a stark contrast to the darkness within of gates. She reviewed the night's events, the shot timed with precision. Christian's death tied to his financial scrutiny. Lewis's revolver conveniently placed. The family's reactions, Gina's tears, Walter's silence, Mildred's outrage. Stephen and Alex's unity formed a pattern, but one piece was missing. She thought of the play with its themes of deception and of Christian's words about trust. In St. Mary Mead, trust was often betrayed by those closest, and she suspected the same here. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's mind lingered on Ernie's revelation. Christian's questions about money had threatened someone, and his death was the result. She recalled a village scandal where a treacherous error had led to a fatal confrontation, and wondered if Stonygates held a similar secret. Her knitting lay untouched, her thoughts weaving a tapestry of motives, greed, fear, or loyalty twisted into betrayal. The stage, she sensed, had been set not just for a play, but for murder, and she would watch the next act with unyielding attention. Chapter 5. The puzzle takes shape the morning after Christian Gulbranson's murder dawned grey and heavy. The mist over Stonygates thicker than before, as if the estate itself mourned. Miss Jane Marple awoke early, her sleep disturbed by the echo of that fatal shot, so cleverly masked by the play's climax. She stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, gazing at the shrouded lawns. The scene reminded her of St. Mary Mead after a scandal quiet, but charged with whispers of suspicion. Dressing in a neat tweed skirt and a pale blue cardigan, she prepared for a day of quiet observation, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the puzzle: Christian's death, his financial concerns, and the household's tangled motives. In her village, such fragments had once led to a poacher's confession. Here, she sensed, they would reveal a killer. Breakfast was a subdued affair, served in the dining room with its looming portraits and heavy silver. The household gathered, reluctantly, their faces drawn. Carrie Louise, pale but composed, sat at one end, her delicate hands clasped tightly. Lewis, sericold at the head, spoke little, his usual fervour dimmed, his eyes shadowed. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy muted, clung to Walter Hudd's arm, though his brooding silence offered little comfort. Mildred Street, her lips pursed, stirred her tea with unnecessary force, her disapproval palpable. Stephen and Alex, Resteric, usually rivals, sat in uneasy alliance, their charm subdued. Edgar Lawson, Lewis's assistant, hovered near his employer, his nervous tics more pronounced, his devotion almost desperate. Miss Marple, taking her seat, noted each expression, her village instincts alert to the undercurrents of grief, fear, and something less definable. Inspector Curry, who had stayed overnight to coordinate the investigation, joined them briefly, his presence a reminder of the tragedy. He announced that the police were continuing their inquiries and would need statements from all. "We're examining the revolver and the study," he said, his tone measured but firm. Any information, however small, could help. His eyes lingered on Lewis, who nodded stiffly, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in Edgar's glance. In St. Mary Mead, such glances often betrayed guilt. like the sexton who had fidgeted when questioned about a missing chalice. After breakfast, the household dispersed, some to give statements, others to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Miss Marple sought out Carrie Louise, finding her in the drawing-room, arranging flowers with mechanical precision. The room, with its faded chintz and heavy drapes, felt stifling, and Carrie Louise's smile was strained. "Jane, you must think us a dreadful lot," she said, her voice trembling. "First this play, now this." Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting, offered a reassuring murmur, her needles clicking softly. "Trouble comes to every house, my dear, but truth has a way of surfacing." Gently, she probed about Christian's concerns, recalling his mention of a matter of trust. Carrie Louise hesitated, her fingers crushing a petal. "He was worried about the reformatory's accounts," she admitted. "He found discrepancies, he called them. He wanted to discuss it with Lewis and me, but we never had the chance." Her eyes filled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, thinking of a St. Mary Mead widow who had discovered her husband's debts only after his death. The revelation of financial irregularities sharpened her focus on Lewis, whose passion for the reformatory had seemed almost too fervent. Inspector Curry summoned Miss Marple to the study, now a crime scene cordoned off by police tape. The room, with its oak panelling and leather-bound books, retained an air of order despite the tragedy. The desk where Christian had been found bore traces of police work chalk marks, dusted surfaces. Curry, his notebook open, valued Miss Marple's reputation for insight and invited her thoughts. "You were at the play, Miss Marple. Anything strike you as odd?" he asked, his gaze shrewd. She spoke softly, her words precise. "The shot's timing was deliberate, Inspector, synchronized with the play to confuse the ear. And Mr. Goldbranson's work, those papers he was reviewing might hold the key." Curry nodded, revealing that Christian had been drafting a letter to the reformatory's board, hinting at financial mismanagement. "We found it half-written," he said, showing her a page in Christian's angular script. The words urgent, review and misallocated funds stood out, and Miss Marple's mind raced. In her village, a similar letter had exposed a treasurer's fraud, leading to a confrontation. Here, she suspected, it had led to murder. Leaving the study, Miss Marple wandered to the great hall, where the stage stood abandoned, its props scattered like relics of a forgotten ritual. The reformatory boys, under staff supervision, were clearing the area, their usual discipline frayed by the tragedy. She spotted Ernie, the sly-faced lad, stacking chairs with a sullen air. Approaching him, she offered a warm smile and a peppermint, her village tactic for coaxing confidences. "You did well with the lights, Ernie," she said, her tone kind. "You must notice things others miss." Ernie's grin flickered, but his eyes were wary. "Dunno, miss, just do me job." She pressed gently, mentioning the study's proximity to the stage. "Folks was always in and out," he muttered, glancing around. "Saw Mr. Sericold near there before the big scene. Looked funny, like he was hiding summit." His words, though vague, were a thread in the tapestry, and Miss Marple let him go, recalling a St. Mary Mead boy who had seen a thief flee but feared to tell. She returned to the drawing-room, where Gina sat alone, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, offering a handkerchief, invited her to talk, sensing the girl's need for solace. Gina's words tumbled out her love for Stonygates, her worry for Carrie Louise, and her strained marriage to Walter. "He hates it here," she confessed. "Says Lewis treats him like an outsider, And now this. I don't know what to think." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, thinking of a St. Mary Mead bride whose husband's resentment had led to petty theft. Walter's discontent, she noted, could be a motive or a distraction. The afternoon brought further interviews, and Miss Marple observed from the sidelines as Inspector Curry questioned the family. Lewis, composed but pale, reiterated that he had left Christian in the study to join the audience, unaware of any trouble. His revolver, he insisted, was rarely checked, and anyone could have taken it. Mildred, her voice sharp, claimed she had been in the hall, noticing Lewis's absence but assuming he was with Carrie Louise. Stephen and Alex, questioned together, confirmed their backstage duties, their mutual alibi seamless but, to Miss Marple's ear, practiced. Walter, gruff and defensive, said he had been in the wings, too busy with props to notice anything. Edgar, trembling, swore he had been fetching costumes. His loyalty to Lewis unwavering. Miss Marple, invited to share further thoughts, suggested the killer knew the play's schedule intimately. The revolver's placement in the study, not backstage, is curious, she said. It suggests premeditation, not impulse. Curry, impressed, noted her point, and Miss Marple withdrew, her mind turning to the household's motives. Money, she knew from village scandals, was a powerful driver. Christian's discovery of financial irregularities threatened someone Lewis, perhaps, whose reformatory was his life's work, or another who benefited from its funds, seeking fresh air. Miss Marple strolled the gardens, where the mist had lifted, revealing the stark lines of the reformatory buildings. She encountered Stephen, pruning roses with a distracted air. His charm surfaced, but his eyes were troubled. "This business with Christian, it's shaken us all," he said, snipping a thorned stem. Miss Marple, commenting on the roses, gently probed about the reformatory. Stephen's reply was guarded. "Lewis does good work, but it's costly." Christian was always poking into the accounts. His tone held no malice, but Miss Marple noted his unease, recalling a St. Mary Mead gardener who had hidden debts behind a cheerful facade. Dinner was a strained affair, the family's attempts at normalcy faltering. Carrie Louise, valiant but frail, spoke of the reformatory's future, but Lewis's responses were curt, his thoughts elsewhere. Mildred's complaints about the estate's neglect grew sharper, while Gina's forced brightness grated on Walter, who left early. Alex, trying to lighten the mood, recounted a play anecdote, but Stephen's silence dampened his efforts. Edgar, serving coffee, spilled a cup, his nerves betraying him. Miss Marple, savouring her soup, watched them all, her village instincts alert to the cracks in their composure. After dinner, she retired to the library, a quiet haven of leather-bound volumes and dim lamps. Taking up her knitting, she reflected on the day's discoveries, Christian's letter, Ernie's observation of Lewis, Gina's marital woes, Stephen's reticence. The puzzle was taking shape, but its heart remained elusive. She thought of the play, with its deceptive twists, and of Christian's scrutiny of the accounts. In St. Mary Mead, financial secrets had led to betrayal, as when a shopkeeper's error masked a theft. Here, she suspected, the stakes were higher as she prepared for bed. Miss Marple passed the study, now locked and guarded by a constable. She paused, imagining Christian at the desk, his pen poised over that damning letter. The revolver, Lewis's own, troubled Hurt's presence too convenient, its use too bold. She recalled a village incident where a stolen knife had been planted to mislead, and wondered if the gun served a similar purpose. Her knitting lay idle, her thoughts weaving a pattern of suspicion. The killer, she sensed, was close, hidden, among the players of Stonygates, and she would find them, as she always did, by following the threads of human nature. Chapter 6. Shadows of motive. The fourth day at Stonygates broke with a sullen sky, the clouds low and heavy, mirroring the gloom that had settled over the household since Christian Gulbranson's murder. Miss Jane Marple, rising with her usual punctuality, stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The mist had cleared, but the estate's lawns lay damp and grey, the reformatory buildings stark against the old house's faded grandeur. She dressed in a practical tweed suit, her movements brisk despite the weight of her thoughts. The puzzle of Christian's death, his letter about financial discrepancies, Ernie's glimpse of Lewis near the study. The revolver's convenient placement had begun to coalesce, yet its edges remained elusive. In St. Mary Mead, such puzzles often unravelled through the quiet observation of human frailties, and Miss Marple prepared for a day of watching and listening, her village instincts as sharp as ever. Breakfast was a strained ritual, the dining room's high ceilings amplifying the clink of cutlery and the murmur of subdued voices. Carrie Louise, fragile in a pale blue gown, attempted to lighten the mood with talk of the gardens, but her smile faltered under the weight of grief. Louis Sericold, seated at the head, was unusually silent, his fervent idealism dimmed, his eyes fixed on his plate. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy dulled, sat close to Walter Hudd, whose brooding presence seemed to isolate him further. Mildred Street, her severe expression accentuated by a drab brown dress, stirred her tea with a vigour that betrayed her agitation. Stephen and Alex Restorick, their rivalry momentarily subdued, exchanged guarded glances, their usual banter absent. Edgar Lawson, Lewis's assistant, hovered near his employer, his nervous tics more pronounced, his devotion tinged with desperation. Miss Marple, taking her seat, noted each detail, their postures, their silences, recalling a St. Mary Mead breakfast, where a family's tension had betrayed a hidden theft. Inspector Curry, who had returned to continue his investigation, joined them briefly, his presence a stark reminder of the tragedy. He reported that the revolver bore no clear fingerprints, wiped clean before being left in the study. "We're tracing Mr. Gulbranson's movements," he said, his tone steady but probing. "His papers suggest he was auditing the reformatory's accounts. If anyone knows why, speak now." His gaze swept the table, lingering on Lewis, who nodded curtly, his jaw tight. Miss Marple caught Edgar's fleeting wince, a gesture that echoed a village lad's discomfort when questioned about a broken window. She filed it away, her mind turning to Christian's letter, with its ominous hints of misallocated funds. After breakfast, the household scattered, some to face further police questions, others to seek solace in routine. Miss Marple sought out Inspector Curry, who welcomed her insight in the library, a quiet haven of leather-bound books and faded tapestries. The room's calm contrasted with the study's grim associations, and Curry, his notebook open, invited her thoughts. "You've a knack for seeing things, Miss Marple," he said, his shrewd eyes meeting hers. "What's your take on this business?" She spoke softly, her words measured. "Mr. Gulbranson's death was no impulse, Inspector. His audit threatened someone who knew the play's schedule and the revolver's location. The study, not the stage, as the scene suggests calculation." Curry nodded, revealing that Christian's papers included a ledger with circled entry sums transferred to obscure accounts, unexplained. "It's not proof of theft," he said, "but it's enough to raise questions." Miss Marple, thinking of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper whose errors hid embezzlement, suggested examining Lewis's financial oversight. Curry agreed, his respect for her evident, and she withdrew, her mind buzzing with possibilities, determined to explore the household's motives. Miss Marple wandered to the great hall, where the stage stood dismantled, its props stacked haphazardly. A few reformatory boys swept the floor, their movements listless under the tragedy shadow. She spotted Ernie, the sharp-faced lad, polishing a candelabra with exaggerated care. Approaching him, she offered a warm smile and a peppermint, her village tactic for loosening tongues. "You've a keen eye, Ernie," she said, her tone gentle. "You must hear things, working so close to everyone." Ernie's sly grin flickered, but his eyes were cautious. "Dunno much, miss. Folks argue, that's all." She pressed lightly, mentioning Christian's questions about money. Ernie hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice low. "Heard Mr. Gulbranson and Mr. Saracold at it, day before the play. Something about funds going missing. Mr. Saracold said it was a mistake, but he sounded proper rattled. His words, though guarded, were a vital thread, and Miss Marple thanked him. Recalling a St. Mary Mead boy who had overheard a smuggler's deal behind the pub, she sought out Gina next, finding her in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven of ferns and orchids. Gina, her eyes still red, was pruning a plant with unsteady hands. Miss Marple, offering a sympathetic murmur, sat beside her, her knitting a pretext for conversation. Gina's defenses crumbled, and she spoke of her love for Stonygates, her worry for Carrie Louise, and her growing distance from Walter. "He feels trapped here," she said, her voice breaking. "He thinks Lewis looks down on him, and now this murder. It's tearing us apart." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, thinking of a St. Mary Mead couple whose resentment had led to sabotage. Walter's alienation, she noted, could breed desperation, though whether it extended to murder remained unclear. Leaving Gina, Miss Marple strolled the gardens, where the damp air carried the scent of earth and decay. She encountered Mildred, bundled in a shapeless coat, inspecting a flower bed with a critical eye. Mildred's greeting was curt, but Miss Marple's gentle inquiries softened her reserve. "Mother gives too much to this reformatory," Mildred said, her voice sharp. "It's draining the estate, my inheritance, if you must know." Christian saw it too, but Lewis wouldn't listen. Her bitterness was raw, and Miss Marple, commenting on the roses, noted her motive greed, cloaked in concern. In her village, a spinster's envy had once led to vandalism. Here, the stakes were deadlier. The afternoon brought more police interviews, and Miss Marple observed from a discreet corner of the drawing-room. Inspector Curry questioned Lewis again, pressing him on the reformatory's accounts. Lewis, his composure fraying, insisted all funds were accounted for, his passion for the boys' welfare overriding any clerical errors. Curry's skepticism was evident, and Miss Marple caught Edgar's anxious glance, his loyalty strained. Stephen and Alex, questioned separately, admitted to financial concerns but distanced themselves from the accounts, their unity less convincing today. Walter, gruff as ever, claimed ignorance of the reformatory's workings, his defensiveness bordering on hostility. Miss Marple, her needles idle, thought of a St. Mary Mead farmer whose bluster had hidden a forged deed. Seeking a quieter perspective, Miss Marple visited the reformatory schoolroom, where a young teacher oversaw a class of boys. The room, with its maps and chalkboards, was a stark contrast to the house's opulence, and the boy's focus impressed her. She spoke with the teacher, an earnest woman named Miss Bell, who praised Lewis's vision but admitted the reformatory's costs were high. Mr. Gulbranson was asking about budgets, she said, her tone cautious. He seemed troubled. Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead schoolmaster whose queries had uncovered a trustee's fraud. The reformatory, she realized, was the heart of the mystery. Its funds a magnet for deceit. Dinner was a sombre affair, the family's attempts at civility strained. Carrie Louise, valiant but frail, spoke of Christian's dedication to the trust, her voice catching. Lewis, his responses clipped, deflected questions about the accounts, his eyes avoiding queries. Mildred's complaints grew pointed, her resentment of the reformatory's drain on the estate barely veiled. Gina, forcing a smile, tried to engage. Alex, in talk of the play, but his wit was forced, and Stephen's silence was heavy. Walter, barely touching his food, left early, his absence noted by all. Edgar, serving coffee, fumbled a saucer, his nerves betraying him. Miss Marple, savouring her consomme, watched the interplay, her village instincts alert to the shadows of motive, greed, resentment, fear. After dinner, she retired to the library, its dim lamps casting long shadows. Taking up her knitting, she reflected on the day's revelations. Ernie's account of Lewis's argument with Christian, Gina's marital strain, Mildred's inheritance woes, the reformatory's murky finances. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the killer's identity remained elusive. She thought of Christian's ledger with its circled sums, and of Lewis's revolver, too conveniently placed. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen brooch had been planted to mislead. Here, she suspected, the gun served a similar purpose as she prepared. For bed, Miss Marple passed the schoolroom, where a light still burned. Peering in, she saw Ernie, alone, sketching in a notebook. He started at her approach, but she smiled, offering a peppermint. "You're fond of drawing," she said, glancing at his page, a rough sketch of the stage, with a figure holding a gun. Ernie shrugged, closing the book. "Just messing about," Miss G nodded, her mind racing. The sketch, though crude, suggested he had seen more than he admitted, and she resolved to watch him closely. In her village, a boy's doodle had once revealed a thief's hideout. Here, it might point to a murderer. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the starry sky a stark contrast to the darkness within. The motives were clear: Lewis's control of the funds, Mildred's greed, Walter's resentment, Stephen and Alex's rivalry, Edgar's blind loyalty, but the truth lay deeper in the interplay of trust and betrayal. She thought of the play's title, The Heart's Deception, and of Christian's audit, a threat to someone's facade. In St. Mary Mead, truth emerged in quiet moments, revealed by a careless glance or a whispered word. Here, she sensed, the shadows of motive were gathering, and she would be ready when they took form. Chapter 7. A Boy's Tale. The fifth morning at Stonygates brought a tentative sun, its rays piercing the clouds to cast long shadows across the estate's damp lawns. Miss Jane Marple, rising early as was her custom, stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The reformatory buildings, stark against the old house's ivy-clad walls, seemed less imposing in the light. Yet the air held a lingering unease, as if the murder of Christian Gulbranson had left an indelible mark. She dressed in a neat grey skirt and a soft wool cardigan, her appearance unassuming but her pale blue eyes sharp with purpose. The puzzle was gaining clarity. Christian's audit of the reformatory's finances, Ernie's hint of Lewis Serra agitation, the revolver's calculated placement, but its heart remained hidden. In St. Mary Mead, truth often surfaced through the unguarded words of the young, and Miss Marple resolved to pursue the thread offered by Ernie, the sly-faced reformatory boy whose observations might unlock the mystery. Breakfast was a hushed affair, the dining room's grandeur overshadowed by the household strain. Carrie Louise, her frail beauty accentuated by a pale green dress, managed to smile but ate little, her hands trembling. Lewis Serracold, at the table's head, was subdued, his usual zeal replaced by a distracted air, his eyes avoiding the empty chair where Christian had sat. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy a shadow of itself, sat beside Walter Hudd, whose brooding silence seemed to deepen the gloom. Mildred Street, her severe features set, sipped her tea with a precision that betrayed her tension. Stephen and Alex Restrick, their rivalry muted by the tragedy, spoke in low tones, their charm absent. Edgar Lawson, Lewis's assistant, served coffee with a nervous energy that bordered on panic, his devotion to Lewis strained by the police's scrutiny. Miss Marple, taking her seat, noted each nuance their guarded glances, their forced civility recalling a St. Mary Mead. Breakfast, where a family's silence had hidden a poisoning. Inspector Curry, who had returned to press the investigation, joined them briefly, his presence a quiet authority. He reported that the police were analyzing Christian's ledger, which showed unexplained transfers to a private account. "We're tracing the recipient," he said, his gaze sweeping the table. "If anyone knows of Mr. Goldbranson's plans that night, come forward." Lewis, his voice tight, claimed ignorance, insisting the accounts were sound. Miss Marple caught Edgar's involuntary flinch, a gesture that echoed a village boy's unease when questioned about a stolen bicycle. She made a mental note, her mind turning to Ernie's revelation of Lewis's argument with Christian, a clue that demanded exploration. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out the reformatory's workshop, where the boys learnt trades under the guidance of a gruff but kindly carpenter. The workshop, a low brick building filled with the scent of sawdust and oil, was a hive of activity, the boys hammering and sanding with focused energy. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, approached the carpenter, Mr. Jenkins, with a polite inquiry about the boys' progress. "They're good lads, mostly," he said, wiping his hands on an apron. "Ernie's clever with his hands, too clever, sometimes." His tone held a mix of pride and caution, and Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead apprentice whose nimble fingers had picked locks as well as planed wood. She spotted Ernie at a workbench, carving a wooden box with intricate care. His sharp features were set in concentration, but his eyes darted to her as she approached. Offering a warm smile and a peppermint, she sat nearby, her knitting a pretext for conversation. "You've a fine talent, Ernie," she said, her voice gentle, "and a sharp eye, I wager, from all your work backstage." Ernie's grin flickered, but his guard was up, his fingers pausing over the wood. "Dunno, miss. Just do what I'm told," he mumbled, his tone evasive. Miss Marple pressed lightly, her village tact honed by years of coaxing confidences. "You mentioned Mr. Serracold near the study before the play's climax. It must be hard, noticing things and not knowing who to tell." Ernie's eyes narrowed, but the peppermint softened his reserve. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Saw morn," I said, "miss. Mr. Serracold was by the study door, holding some it looked like papers, maybe. He went in, then out quick, just before the shot. Didn't tell no one cause. Well, he's the boss. His words, though hesitant, were a revelation, and Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a boy's sighting of a poacher had cracked a burglary case. Here, Ernie's tale pointed to Lewis's involvement. Leaving the workshop, Miss Marple wandered to the gardens, where the sun had begun to warm the earth. She encountered Alex Restorick, sketching the house's facade with a restless energy. His cravat was askew, and his usual flamboyance was tempered by worry. "This place feels cursed," he said, glancing at her. "Christian's death, it's changed everything." Miss Marple, commenting on his sketch, gently probed about the reformatory's finances. Alex's reply was guarded. "Lewis handles the money. Christian was always fussing over it too much, if you ask me." His tone held no malice, but his unease was clear, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling a St. Mary Mead artist whose casual remarks had hinted at a forgery. She sought out Inspector Curry next, finding him in the library, reviewing notes with a constable. The room's quiet, with its rows of books and soft light, offered a respite from the house's tension, and Curry welcomed her perspective. "You've a way of seeing through the fog, Miss Marple," he said, his notebook open. "What's your sense of it now?" She spoke softly, her words precise. Ernie, one of the boys, saw Mr. Sereckle near the study with papers, moments before the shot. It suggests he was there, perhaps destroying evidence or planting it. Curry's eyes sharpened, and he jotted a note, revealing that the ledger's transfers led to an account in Lewis's name, though not yet confirmed as fraudulent. Miss Marple, thinking of a St. Mary Mead treasurer caught by a similar trail, urged caution but felt the net tightening. Determined to understand the family's dynamics, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the conservatory, where her friend was tending orchids with a distracted air. The glass walls amplified the sun's warmth, but Carrie Louise's hands trembled as she snipped a stem. "Jane, I feel so helpless," she said, her voice breaking. "Christian's death, these questions about the accounts, it's too much." Miss Marple, offering a comforting pat, probed about Lewis's role in the finances. Carrie Louise's. The reply was hesitant. "He's always managed everything. Christian trusted him, but lately there were doubts." Her words, though vague, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, and she thought of a St. Mary Mead widow whose husband's management had masked debts. Lunch was a tense affair, the family's efforts at normalcy strained. Lewis, his composure fraying, spoke of the reformatory's mission, but his words lacked conviction, his eyes darting to Curry, who dined with them. Mildred, her complaints sharper, criticized the police's intrusion, her resentment of the reformatory's costs barely veiled. Gina, forcing brightness, tried to engage Stephen in talk of their childhood, but his responses were curt, and Alex's silence was heavy. Walter, barely eating, stared at his plate, his isolation palpable. Edgar, serving soup, spilled a ladle, his nerves betraying him. Miss Marple, savoring her salad, watched the interplay, her village instincts alert to the cracks in their facade sphere. Guilt or defiance. After lunch, Miss Marple visited the reformatory's library, a small room filled with donated books and worn desks. A young librarian, Miss Tate, was cataloguing volumes, her manner earnest but anxious. Miss Marple, inquiring about the boy's reading, steered the conversation to Christian's visits. "He came often," Miss Tate said, her voice low, "always. Asking about budgets, donations. He was particular." Her hesitation suggested unease. and Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead librarian who had uncovered a donor's fraud through meticulous records. The reformatory's finances, she realized, were a web, and Christian's probing had threatened to unravel it. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple approached Stephen in the hall, where he was sorting props from the play. His charm was subdued, his eyes tired. "This murder, it's a nightmare," he said, stacking a chair. Miss Marple, commenting on the play's success, gently asked about Christian's role in the trust. Stephen's reply was cautious. He was strict about the money. Lewis didn't always like it, but they worked together. His words held no accusation, but his tension was evident, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling a St. Mary Mead merchant whose partnership had hidden rivalry. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the workshop, hoping to catch Ernie alone. She found him sweeping sawdust, his grin absent, his eyes wary. Offering another peppermint, she spoke softly. "You've been very helpful, Ernie. That sketch of yours, was it something you saw that night?" Ernie froze, then nodded. His voice barely audible. "Drew what I saw Mr. Sir recalled, near the study, with that gun in his hand, before the shot. Didn't tell no one, 'cause he's good to us." His confession, though reluctant, was a cornerstone, and Miss Marple thanked him, her heart heavy. In her village, a boy's fear had kept a thief's secret. Here, it shielded a murderer. Dinner was a somber ritual, the family's silences louder than their words. Carrie Louise, valiant but frail, spoke of Christian's legacy, her voice catching. Lewis, his responses clipped, deflected talk of the accounts, his eyes on his plate. Mildred's bitterness surfaced, her comments on the estate's neglect pointed. Gina, trying to lighten the mood, teased Alex about his script, but his wit was forced, and Stephen's silence deepened. Walter, barely touching his food, left early, his absence noted. Edgar, serving dessert, dropped a spoon, his nerves raw. Miss Marple, savouring her custard, watched them all, her village instincts alert to the weight of Ernie's tale. After dinner, she retired to the drawing room, its fire casting flickering shadows. Taking up her knitting, she reflected on the day's discoveries, Ernie's sighting of Lewis with the gun, Christian's ledger pointing to Lewis's account, the family's motives, Mildred's greed, Walter's resentment, Stephen and Alex's unease, Edgar's loyalty. The puzzle was nearly complete, but its final shape eluded her. She thought of the play's deceptive twists and of Christian's threat to expose a truth. In St. Mary Mead, truth emerged through the young and the overlooked, as when a maid's gossip had revealed a blackmailer. Here, Ernie's tale was the key, and she would use it to unlock the darkness at Stonygates. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple passed the workshop, now dark. She paused, imagining Ernie's sketch, its crude lines a map to the truth. The revolver, Lewis's own, troubled Hertz used to bold, its placement too staged. She recalled a village incident where a planted tool had misled the police, and wondered if the gun was a similar ruse. Her knitting lay untouched, her thoughts weaving a pattern of betrayal. The killer, she sensed, was close, his shadow cast, by the very trust he betrayed, and she would be ready when the light fell upon him. Chapter 8. The mirror cracks. The 6th day at Stonygates dawned with a brittle clarity, the sun cutting through the morning mist to reveal the estate's lawns in sharp relief. Miss Jane Marple, rising with her customary punctuality, stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The reformatory buildings, their red brick softened by the light, stood in quiet contrast to the old house's weathered stone. yet the air held a tension that no sunlight could dispel. Christian Gulbranson's murder had cast a long shadow, and Miss Marple's mind was alive with the threads she had gathered. Ernie's confession of seeing Lewis siroccoed with the revolver, the ledger's damning transfers, the household's web of motives. In St. Mary Mead, such threads had once led to a shopkeeper's confession of fraud. Here, they pointed to a darker truth. She dressed in a sober grey dress, her movements brisk, her pale blue eyes sharp with resolve. Today, she sensed, the puzzle would resolve, its pieces falling into place like the final stitches of her knitting. Breakfast was a strained ritual, the dining room's high ceilings amplifying the clatter of cutlery and the weight of unspoken fears. Carrie Louise, her frail beauty accentuated by a cream shawl, managed a faint smile, but her hands trembled as she lifted her teacup. Lewis, Sarah-cold, at the table's head, was pale, his fervent idealism replaced by a brittle calm, his eyes avoiding the gazes of others. Gina Hudd, her usual sparkle dimmed, sat beside Walter Hudd, whose brooding silence seemed to deepen the gloom. Mildred Street, her severe features set, buttered her toast with a precision that betrayed her agitation. Stephen and Alex, their rivalry subdued, spoke in hushed tones, their charm a distant memory. Edgar Lawson, Lewis's assistant, moved with a jittery deference, his loyalty strained to breaking. Miss Marple, taking her seat, noted each detail, their guarded postures, their fleeting glances, recalling a St. Mary Mead. Breakfast, where a family's tension had preceded a blackmailer's exposure. Inspector Curry, who had returned to press the investigation, joined them briefly, his presence a quiet command. He reported that the account linked to the ledger's transfers was indeed in Lewis's name, though he cautioned that motive was not yet proof. "We're close," he said, his shrewd eyes sweeping the table. "If anyone has withheld information, now's the time to speak." Lewis, his voice tight, reiterated his innocence, claiming the account was for reformatory expenses. Miss Marple caught Edgar's trembling hand as he poured coffee, a gesture that echoed a village lad's panic when caught in a lie. Her mind turned to Ernie's sketch, its crude depiction of Lewis with the gun, and she felt the puzzle's edges sharpening. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought solitude in the library, its leather-bound volumes and dim lamps a haven from the house's strain. Taking up her knitting, she reflected on the theatrical theme of the murder, the shot timed with the play's climax, the revolver left in plain sight. The phrase, "they do it with mirrors," recalled from a St. Mary Mead magician's trick, struck her with sudden clarity. The killer had used the play's chaos as a mirror, reflecting confusion to hide the truth. In her village, a conjurer's sleight had once masked a theft. Here, the murder was a performance, staged to mislead. She resolved to test her theory, her needles clicking as her thoughts wove a pattern of deception, determined to confirm Ernie's account. Miss Marple visited the reformatory's recreation room, where the boys played table tennis under a staff member's watch. The room, with its scuffed floors and faded posters, hummed with youthful energy, though the tragedy's weight lingered. She found Ernie repairing a paddle, his sharp features set in a frown. Offering a warm smile and a peppermint, she sat nearby, her knitting a pretext for conversation. "You've been brave, Ernie, telling me what you saw," she said, her tone gentle. "That sketch of yours, Sit's helped more than you know." Ernie's grin was wary, his eyes darting to the door. "Didn't mean to snitch, miss. Just drew what I saw." She nodded, probing softly about Lewis's movements. Ernie's voice dropped. He was holding the gun, like I said, but he was looking at papers too in, some in the study's grate, before the shot. I hid, didn't want him seeing me. His words, though whispered, were a cornerstone, and Miss Marple thanked him, her heart heavy. In St. Mary Mead, a boy's glimpse of a fire had revealed a forger's panic. Here, it pointed to Lewis's desperation to conceal his crimes. Leaving the recreation room, Miss Marple wandered to the gardens, where the sun had warmed the earth, the scent of roses mingling with damp grass. She encountered Gina, walking alone, her scarlet scarf a bright note against the grey. Gina's eyes were tired, her usual vivacity drained. Miss Marple, offering a sympathetic murmur, walked beside her, steering the conversation to Walter. "He's so angry," Gina confessed, her voice breaking. "He thinks Lewis's work overshadows us, and now this murder. I don't know how to reach him." Miss Marple listened, her needles tucked away, thinking of a St. Mary Mead wife whose husband's resentment had led to sabotage. Walter's motive seemed secondary, but she noted his volatility, a shadow in the puzzle's frame. Seeking further clarity, Miss Marple approached Inspector Curry in the study, now cleared for limited use, but still marked by chalk outlines. The room's oak panelling and heavy desk retained a grim air, and Curry, reviewing notes, welcomed her insight. "You've a knack for cutting through the noise, Miss Marple," he said, his notebook open. "What's your read now?" She spoke softly, her words precise. "Ernie saw Mr. Saracold burning papers in the study before the shot, likely to hide evidence of those transfers. The gun left behind was a mirror trick to reflect blame elsewhere." Curry's eyes narrowed, and he revealed that ash in the grate contained fragments of financial records, supporting her theory. Miss Marple, recalling a St. Mary Mead fire that had hidden alleged secrets, felt the truth drawing near. Determined to confront the heart of the matter, Miss Marple sought Lewis, finding him in the reformatory's office, a sparse room filled with files and a worn desk. He was sorting papers, his movements mechanical, his face haggard. She entered quietly, her presence unthreatening, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Saracold, I've been thinking about mirrors, how they show one thing but hide another. Christian's death was such a mirror, wasn't it? His audit uncovered your secret, and you couldn't let it stand." Lewis's pen froze, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of fear breaking his composure. He tried to protest, his voice rising, but Miss Marple continued, her tone steady. "Ernie saw you with the gun, burning papers to hide the funds you took. You timed the shot with the play, knowing the noise would mask it, and left the revolver to confuse the truth." Lewis's face crumpled, his facade shattering like glass. "I didn't mean for it to come to this," he whispered, his voice raw. "The reformatory needed funds, and I borrowed, intending to repay. Christian found out, threatened to expose me. I panicked. His confession, though halting, was complete. He had siphoned money to cover personal debts, believing his work justified it. Christian's audit, relentless and precise, had forced his hand, and the play's chaos offered a perfect stage." Miss Marple listened, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken, thinking of a St. Mary Mead vicar whose borrowing had led to ruin. She urged Lewis to tell Curry, her voice compassionate but firm, knowing justice must follow. Lunch was a tense affair, the family unaware of Lewis's confession. Carrie Louise, valiant but frail, spoke of the reformatory's future, her voice catching. Mildred, her complaints sharp, criticized the police's delay, her greed thinly veiled. Gina, forcing a smile, tried to engage Alex in talk of their past. But his responses were flat, and Stephen's silence was heavy. Walter, barely eating, stared at his plate, his isolation stark. Edgar, serving soup, fumbled a bowl, his nerves raw. Miss Marple, savouring her salad, watched them, her village instincts, alert to the Irina Lewis's guilt, known only to her, cast their tensions in a new light. After lunch, Miss Marple shared Lewis's confession with Inspector Curry, who acted swiftly, summoning Lewis for questioning. The household, gathered in the drawing room, reacted with shock as Curry arrested Lewis, his calm authority unshaken. Carrie Louise, devastated but resolute, clung to Gina, who wept openly. Mildred, face twisted with vindication, while Walter's silence held a trace of relief. Stephen and Alex, their unity fraying, exchanged stunned glances. Edgar, trembling, collapsed into a chair, his loyalty shattered. Miss Marple, standing quietly, felt a pang of sorrow, recalling a St. Mary Mead family torn by a patriarch's fall. As evening fell, Miss Marple strolled the gardens, the sun sinking behind the reformatory's silhouette. The household's motives, Mildred's greed, Walter's resentment, Stephen and Alex's rivalry. Edgar's devotion had been shadows in a mirror, reflecting Lewis's deeper deceit. She thought of the play, its deceptive twists, a metaphor for the crime, and of Christian, whose trust had been his undoing. In St. Mary Mead, truth emerged through the cracks in human nature, as when a maid's gossip had exposed a thief. Here, the mirror had cracked, revealing Lewis's betrayal, and Miss Marple, her task complete, felt the quiet satisfaction of clarity in her room. She sat by the window, the starry sky a stark contrast to the darkness within Stonygates. Her knitting lay untouched, her thoughts weaving the final threads. Lewis's confession, the ledger's proof, Ernie's courage. The revolver, a prop in a deadly performance, had been the killer's misstep, its boldness betraying his hand. She recalled a village incident where a staged theft had unraveled under scrutiny, and knew Lewis's mirror had failed him. The truth, as always, had surfaced, and she would carry its weight with the calm resolve of one who saw human nature clearly. Chapter 9. The curtain falls. The seventh day at Stonygates broke with a pale, hesitant dawn, the sun struggling through a veil of clouds that mirrored the household's lingering shock. Miss Jane Marple, rising early as was her habit, stood at her window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The estate's lawns, damp from an overnight drizzle, stretched toward the reformatory buildings, their stark lines softened by the morning light. Yet the air held a quiet sorrow, as if the revelation of Lewis Seracald's guilt had drained the life from the old house. Miss Marple's mind, sharp despite the emotional weight of the case, sifted through the final threads. Lewis's confession, Ernie's pivotal testimony, the ledger's damning evidence. In St. Mary Mead, such resolutions often left families fractured, as when a trusted grocer's theft had shattered village harmony. Here, the task remained to mend what could be salvaged, and Miss Marple, dressed in a sober navy dress, her resolve firm to guide the household toward healing. Breakfast was a subdued affair, served in the dining room with its looming portraits and heavy silver, now tinged with the melancholy of a house in mourning. Carrie Louise, her frail beauty accentuated by a pale grey gown, sat with a quiet dignity, her eyes red but resolute. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy subdued, clung to Walter Hudd's arm, his brooding silence softened by a newfound tenderness. Mildred Street, her severe features softened by the shock of Lewis's arrest, sipped her tea with a distracted air. Stephen and Alex Resterick, their rivalry forgotten in the face of tragedy, spoke in low tones, their faces drawn. Edgar Lawson, Lewis's once devoted assistant, was absent, his shattered loyalty leaving him confined to his room. Miss Marple, taking her seat, noted each nuance their tentative gestures, their hushed voices recalling a St. Mary Mead breakfast after a scandal, where healing began with small acts of kindness. Inspector Curry, who had stayed to finalize the case, joined. Then briefly, his presence a steady anchor. He reported that Lewis, now in custody, had provided a full statement, corroborating the financial fraud and the murder's planning. "The evidence is solid," he said, his tone calm but firm. "The ledger, the ash in the study, and the boy's testimony, it all fits." His gaze swept the table, lingering on Carrie Louise, who nodded faintly, her strength a quiet marvel. Miss Marple caught Gina's trembling hand, a gesture that echoed a village girl's grief when her father's deceit was exposed. Her mind turned to the household's future, its wounds deep but not irreparable. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought Carrie Louise, finding her in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven of ferns and orchids that seemed to cradle her fragility. Carrie Louise was arranging flowers, her movements slow but deliberate, as if seeking solace in routine. "Jane, you've been a godsend," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I never imagined Lewis could, but I must go on for the boys." Miss Marple, settling into a wicker chair with her knitting, offered a reassuring smile, her needles clicking softly. "You've a rare strength, my dear. The reformatory is your legacy now." Her words, gentle but firm, echoed her counsel to a St. Mary Mead widow whose husband's betrayal had left her to rebuild alone. Carrie Louise spoke of her plans to appoint a new trustee, one untainted by Lewis's actions, to oversee the reformatories. Finances. "The boys mustn't suffer," she said, her eyes fierce with determination. Miss Marple nodded, probing gently about the family's role. Carrie Louise's reply was thoughtful. "Gina and Walter will stay. I think they love this place, despite everything. Mildred, she needs time, but she'll come round. Stephen and Alex have their own paths, but they'll help where they can." Her clarity impressed Miss Marple, who saw in her friend the resilience of a village matron who had rallied her kin. After a crisis, leaving the conservatory, Miss Marple wandered to the great hall, where the stage's remnants had been cleared, leaving only the velvet curtains as a reminder of the fatal play. A few reformatory boys swept the floor, their movements subdued but purposeful. She spotted Ernie, polishing a banister with a newfound seriousness, his sly grin replaced by a quiet pride. Approaching him, she offered a warm smile and a peppermint, her village tactic for acknowledging courage. "You did a brave thing, Ernie," she said, her tone gentle. "Telling the truth saved more than you know." Ernie's eyes met hers, his guard down. "Didn't want to miss, but you made it seem right. Mr. Sericald, he was good to us, but wrong's wrong." His words, simple but profound, touched Miss Marple, who thanked him. Thinking of a St. Mary Mead lad whose honesty had exposed a thief, earning him the village's respect. Ernie's role, she knew, would strengthen the reformatory. His truth a foundation for its renewal. Determined to support Gina, Miss Marple sought her out in the gardens, where the sun had begun to warm the damp earth. Gina, wrapped in a scarlet coat, was tending roses, her hands unsteady but her face resolute. Miss Marple, walking beside her, offered a sympathetic murmur, steering the conversation to Walter. "He's trying," Gina said, her voice soft. "This awful business it's made him see what matters. We're going to work on us, for Granny's sake." Miss Marple listened, her knitting tucked away, thinking of a St. Mary Mead couple whose crisis had forged a stronger bond. She urged Gina to nurture that hope, her counsel gentle but firm, knowing love could heal where suspicion had wounded. Next, Miss Marple approached Mildred, finding her in the library, sorting old letters with a distracted air. The room's quiet, with its rows of books and soft light, offered a respite from the house's grief. And Mildred's greeting, though curt, softened under Miss Marple's gentle inquiries. "I was wrong about Mother," Mildred admitted, her voice low. "I thought her generosity foolish, but she's stronger than I knew." Miss Marple, commenting on the letters, encouraged forgiveness, her words echoing her advice to a St. Mary Mead spinster whose envy had isolated her. Mildred's nod, though hesitant, was a step toward reconciliation, and Miss Marple left her with a sense of progress. Lunch was a tentative step toward normalcy, the family's conversation halting but sincere. Carrie Louise, bolstered by her resolve, spoke of the reformatory's future, her vision clear. Gina, her brightness returning, teased Stephen about his stage directions, drawing a faint smile. Alex, his wit subdued, listened quietly, while Walter's gruff responses held a trace of warmth. Mildred, less sharp, joined the talk, her bitterness easing. Edgar, still absent, was mentioned with pity, his loyalty to Lewis a wound yet to heal. Miss Marple, savouring her soup, watched the interplay, her village instincts alert to the seeds of renewal. Small gestures, shared glances that promised healing. After lunch, Miss Marple visited the reformatory schoolroom, where Miss Bell, the young teacher, was guiding a class of boys through a history lesson. The room's maps and chalkboards, worn but vibrant, reflected the boys' potential, and Miss Bell's dedication impressed Miss Marple. Inquiring about the boys' morale, she learned that Ernie's honesty had inspired them, his courage a quiet example. "They're shaken, but they trust Mrs. Saracord," Miss Bell said, her voice earnest. Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead school where a pupil's bravery had rallied his peers after a scandal. The reformatory, she saw, would endure, its mission carried forward by those it had touched. Seeking a final perspective, Miss Marple approached Stephen in the hall, where he was packing the last of the play's props. His charm was subdued, his eyes tired but hopeful. "We'll rebuild for Carrie Louise," he said, stacking a box. Miss Marple, commenting on the play's success, asked about his plans. Stephen's reply was thoughtful. "Alex and I will help where we can, but this place needs new blood. Carrie Louise will see it through." His clarity, free of rivalry, reassured Miss Marple, who saw in him the steadiness of a St. Mary Mead farmer who had rebuilt after a fire. As evening approached, Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her task at Stonygates complete. She joined Carrie Louise in the drawing room, where a fire cast a warm glow, softening the room's faded elegance. Carrie Louise, her strength renewed, thanked her friend with quiet fervour. "You saw what I couldn't, Jane. You've given us a chance to start again." Miss Marple, her knitting idle, smiled, her heart full. "Truth is a hard gift, my dear, but it frees those who receive it." Her words, gentle but profound, echoed her farewell to a St. Mary Mead family healed by a painful revelation. Dinner was a quieter affair, the family's wounds still raw but their unity growing. Carrie Louise, her voice steady, spoke of new plans for the reformatory, her passion undimmed. Gina, her arm linked with Walter's, laughed softly, a spark of her old self. Mildred, her severity eased, listened attentively, her resentment fading. Stephen and Alex, their bond strengthened, shared a quiet joke, their rivalry a thing of the past. Edgar, absent but mentioned with kindness, was promised support. Miss Marple, savouring her dessert, watched them. Her village instincts attuned to the fragile hope that bound them, hope born of truth. As in St. Mary Mead when a community rallied after a betrayal. After dinner, Miss Marple strolled the gardens. One last time, the stars, bright against the night sky. The reformatory's silhouette, once ominous, now seemed a beacon of potential. Its boys the true legacy of Carrie Louise's dream. She thought of Lewis, whose good intentions had twisted into deceit, and of Christian, whose trust had cost him his life. The play, with its deceptive mirrors, had been a metaphor for the crime, its chaos a shield for Lewis's guilt. In St. Mary Mead, truth emerged through the quiet courage of the overlooked maids. Boys, spinsters and here. Ernie's tale had cracked the mirror, revealing the heart of the mystery dot in her room. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her thoughts weaving the final threads. Lewis's fall, Carrie Louise's resilience, the family's tentative renewal. The revolver, a prop in a deadly act, had been Lewis's undoing, its boldness betraying his hand. She recalled a village incident where a staged theft had collapsed under scrutiny, and knew the truth had prevailed here, as it always did, through patience and clarity. Tomorrow she would board the train to St. Mary Mead. Her task complete, her heart light with the knowledge that Stonygates would endure, its wounds healing under Carrie Louise's care as she prepared for bed. Miss Marple glanced at her suitcase, packed with her tweeds and shawls, ready for the journey home. The starry sky, vast and unyielding, reminded her of the human heart, flawed, complex, but capable of redemption. She thought of her village, where every scandal, every secret, had taught her the power of truth. Here, at Stonygates, that truth had fallen like a curtain, closing the act of deception and opening a new scene of hope. With a quiet smile, she turned from the window, ready to rest, her work done.